Hi there. Welcome to Power Play. I'm Vashi Capellos in Ottawa on this Tuesday. Tonight, former Prime Minister Stephen Harper's big moment.
Now, I know that there are many here who have been looking forward for a long time to my public hanging.
Stephen Harper's official portrait has just been unveiled as part of several events this week to mark 20 years since he became Prime Minister. Prominent cabinet ministers of his have descended on the nation's capital for the ceremony. They're going to join us in studio here a little bit later on. And we're going to check in with CTV's Mulcair, who listened into the speeches. Plus, we'll go one-on-one with one of Harper's biggest foes in the House and friends outside of the House, Tom Mulcair. Then, bipartisan partnership.
I know the leader of the opposition is just visiting his riding.
I realize the Prime Minister is just visiting Canada.
The Liberals and Conservatives are pledging to cooperate to fast-track a GST relief bill. But as you heard there, they weren't exactly all smiles in question period. Poilievre and Carney are set to meet face-to-face this week to talk party priorities. So what's at stake politically for each leader? Our pollster of record, Nick Nanos, has brand new numbers on exactly that, and he'll join us coming up. Plus, the federal Liberals poach a provincial New Democrat.
When Canadians see politicians betray the values and policies that they claim to believe in, I think it damages our democracy and it breeds cynicism in our politics.
The deputy leader of Ontario's NDP will run for the federal Liberals in the riding held for the last decade by Bill Blair. There's a bit of a by-election bonanza, in fact, headed our way. The front bench is set to talk about that coming up. Dan Moulton, Shakir Chambers, George Soul, Laura Stone, and Bob Fife will join me a little bit later on in the show. First, though.
I remember thinking that the young man had promise. And I had just heard there were openings at a nearby bank. So I forwarded the resume on, and lo and behold, he was hired, and he has apparently gone on to enjoy some success.
We are going to start tonight with the unveiling of former Prime Minister Stephen Harper's official portrait, set to join the collection of prime ministerial paintings in the House of Commons foyer. Harper's speech at the ceremony has wrapped literally moments ago, where he reflected on his time as Prime Minister. The unveiling is part of a series of commemorative events this week to mark 20 years since he first became Prime Minister. Colleagues from his time in power, from cabinet ministers to MPs to senior staff, have descended on our nation's capital for the anniversary. We're going to speak to some of them a little bit later on in the show. Prime Minister Mark Carney, who served as the Governor of Bank of Canada under Prime Minister Harper, also spoke at the ceremony just moments ago. Have a listen to that.
As those who have known him privately can attest, Stephen Harper has never been drawn to spectacle, but always to service. In a political climate increasingly buffeted by noise, he brought composure, intellect, and decisiveness to public life. Qualities that helped see Canada through one of the most perilous times since the Great Depression.
Our senior political correspondent, Mike Mulcair, is with me here in studio. Hey, Mike, just a room full of the country's most important Conservatives, Premier Ford, Premier Moe, a ton of cabinet ministers, Mr. Poilievre. I think you mentioned Mr. Chrétien was there, as well as Prime Minister Carney and Prime Minister Harper.
Gary Bettman, the NHL
Gary Bettman,
commissioner,
how could I forget?
Well. That was something that was a bit of a shock.
I want to start where the Prime Minister Harper ended, because he concluded his speech essentially by saying, both political parties essentially have to unite to face off or fend off the threat we face externally and the threat to unity we face internally. A real example over the past few days, and particularly punctuated in this ceremony, of different people from different political stripes coming together in a moment of great importance in this country.
And it's interesting because something we kind of expected last night when you saw that former Prime Minister Jean Chrétien was there on stage with former Prime Minister Harper, and how they both spoke about that need of coming together, not only against the threat from the United States, but also the internal threat of separation from both Alberta and Quebec to a different extent. But to hear it coming from both the Prime Minister there, in the room and the former Prime Minister, Stephen Harper, talking about that need right now. And in that room, as you said, some of the biggest names in politics, the ones that you mentioned, Premier Moe, Premier Ford, and Pierre Poilievre sitting there. And you know, it was interesting as well that Stephen Harper had said, and my leader, and he didn't name Pierre Poilievre, but saying my Conservative leader, a clear sign of support in there as well. But clearly, you know, almost not to say that everybody was on the same page, but a bit of a love in there when you consider how they feel politically. You know, you had Mark Carney say that of Stephen Harper, he said, once in politics, you take risks, and that national unity, national reconciliation are more important than any one party and any one individual. And he punctuated by saying, I fully share that vision, really trying to present not only to the room but to Canadians that we do all need to be on the same page right now in this time and in this moment. But it is an interesting sort of crossover when you consider where the Liberal Party has gone, where it is going now, and where the Conservatives were at a certain time, and almost as if that the Carney Liberals are now sort of really bleeding over to the Harper Conservatives as they once were.
Well, I think, although some clear distinctions made by, you know, jokingly by former Prime Minister Harper when he said, like, you know, I've got a balanced budget in my hand and stuff. Maybe I could show that to Francois Philippe Champagne, the Minister of Finance. Let's take a look at the portrait, if we could bring up some video that I think we have from that ceremony. A couple of interesting things that he noted, like the Phil Richards, who painted it, spent days with him, right?
Planning it,
figuring it out. A coffee cup with the Beatles on it, his office from Centre Block, photos of his family, both his parents and brothers, and then also his kids and his wife. The flag of Alberta, where he spent his adult life. The flag of Ontario, where he grew up. The New Brunswick flag, that's where his kind of ancestors were from. The Southern Alberta First Nation that anointed him kind of an honorary chief. Pardon me. Trade agreements that he signed, because it was a big deal during
on the shelf.
Yeah, a balanced budget in his hand. Even Stanley the cat. For those of us who covered the Harper years will remember Stanley the cat.
Who he said oftentimes polled higher than he did, and you know, who can't say that a feline would. But interesting how he also said that the tie that he's wearing in that portrait, it actually doesn't exist in real life, and it was made of the different sort of shades of conservatism out there, and you know, the Reform Party under Preston Manning, and of course the lighter blue that he said is more sort of indicative of the Quebec nation as well, that he had recognized when he was Prime Minister, and really trying to bring it all together. And the artist had said that there were 25 flags that he is inviting people to try and sort of find as Easter eggs in there. And he said even as meticulously done as the scenic shot that is out the window that they planned together as well. So Stephen Harper, who was known for having a hand in anything that had his name on it, well, certainly has had a hand in this portrait that bears his likeness as well. Okay, thanks, Mike. Appreciate it. Our senior political correspondent, Mike LeCouture. Now, if, like Mike and I, you did cover those years, the last number of them were characterized by a back and forth in the House of Commons that we haven't necessarily seen the likes of since. And that back and forth primarily was between the leader of the NDP at the time, Tom Mulcair, and Prime Minister Harper. Tom is, of course, a CTV News political analyst now, and he is with us live. I think just before, Tom, I get to you, we do have a brand new clip from that speech of Stephen Harper. We'll play a bit of it and get your reaction.
Yeah. I was 26. And I was an eager young assistant to the late Member of Parliament Jim Hawkes. Had anyone told me that I would be standing at this podium today for this event, I would have been quite simply in utter disbelief. Now, I know that there are many here who have been looking forward for a long time to my public hanging. And these public hangings, my friends, are humbling for the condemned man.
So, Tom, like I said, you know, when we covered you versus Harper in the House of Commons, there was nothing really quite like it. A real kind of match of the minds and back and forth like none other. What was it like behind the scenes? What do you know about Stephen Harper that perhaps we wouldn't expect you to?
Well, behind the scenes, Stephen Harper is actually a person with a very good sense of humor, and I'm glad that you chose that example to prove that. You don't often know that about Stephen Harper, and you certainly didn't get a chance to see it unless you spent some time with him. He was easy to talk to, and he respected the rules regarding the leader of the opposition totally. He would call me personally, even on a weekend, make sure you get hold of me if something important was going to happen. He wanted me to know about it. There was a convention. I had to keep absolutely, secret about it. I was a member of the Privy Council for that reason. But Mr. Harper was very respectful of the institutions. And I have to say that, Catherine and I got along quite well with him. I remember bringing him a Christmas gift one year behind the scenes of Parliament. He seemed a little bit flustered. Wasn't expecting something from the two of us. And since then, I mean, we talk about yesterday's fireside chat. I was invited just over a year ago to moderate a fireside chat in Toronto between Jean Chrétien and Stephen Harper, and they've become fast friends. I got to spend time with both of them. And again, Mr. Harper's always very generous with the people that he's known in the past, and he's very easy to talk to. I'm very happy to see him there today. I was there watching on French television where I was working today, watching the unveiling. It's getting a lot of very well-deserved coverage, and I think that the portrait is a very good reflection of it.
Yeah, I thought it was very interesting. I mentioned this with Mike a few moments ago, but that the way in which the speech concluded, which is something that former Prime Minister Chrétien has talked about, but so has Stephen Harper, when they have the opportunity to make comments on national unity and also unity in the face of an external threat in the form of the United States. He basically concluded the speech by calling on political parties, different political parties, to unite in the moment on those areas of significance. What do you make of that?
Bravo, because there's an external threat that we all understand, and we've been living for over a year since Donald Trump was reelected. But there's an internal threat as well in Alberta that shouldn't be underestimated, its gravity. And in Quebec, it's not because we've been through it before in Quebec that it's less serious. But I think that it's time for all political leaders to show strength, not to say, well, we're going to send a message or this or that. No. This has to be about standing up for Canada, one of the greatest countries in the world. We can all be very proud of what we're able to share here together, but we've also got to defend it. I took that away as a key message, and I think that he was quite right.
I wonder also, when you talk about the event that you were hosting with the two of them, when we see that event, that fireside chat last night, when we look at that room and see Prime Minister Carney sitting next to Prime Minister Harper, kind of both of them making jokes, lots of different political parties represented in the room there. I feel as though Canadians will take, and I know it's not always genuine, but it does feel genuine today, will take a lot of solace in, we can't picture that happening in the U.S. right now. How much more protective do you think, how much more protective do you think we are about that part of who we are?
I think that you're onto something very important there, Vashi, and it is genuine. An old friend named Peter Stauffer, who was an MP for years, used to say, how many people have you met in politics that you wouldn't have supper with? I mean, that's the basic test. And the first time I bumped into Mr. Harper was at a lunch that I was having at the same restaurant as him and some of his staff in Montreal, not long after, we had both left politics. Very generous. We took a picture of it, and when I tweeted it out, a lot of people saying, well, what are you doing tweeting out a picture with Harper? I said, well, because we were chit-chatting at the same place where we were having lunch. That's the beauty of politics. You can go after each other because you've got opposing point of view. Always has to be respect for the institutions, for the voters, and for each other. That comes through today, and I think it's a really good message in and of itself.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but you were in the House of Commons just shortly, within a year after the Harper government marks now the 20 years, right, since 2007. When exactly. I've noticed a lot of people who are here in Ottawa right now reflecting on wow, can't believe it's been 20 years. When you think back to that time in politics, what is the biggest change in your view? What is the biggest difference between then and now?
Well, there's not that much difference. But what the big sea change with the arrival of that Conservative Party was the dropping of the part of the name that was progressive. And people weren't too sure. There was some demonization during that campaign that Mr. Harper won in 2006. And he had a lot of, he seemed to have a burden to prove that he was just going to provide a good government with a slightly different point of view on a lot of economic issues. But he He was there for Canadians from coast to coast. You gave a couple of examples before. He reached out, tried to speak with Quebec. He worked so hard. I think this is worth pointing out for people who don't realize how hard it is to master a new language as an adult. But he would work on his French an hour a day. He was doggedly determined, as he is on most things, to make sure that his French was really decent. And you know what? It's even good today, because I was listening to him speak French today.
I also was remembering a story from back in the day when he was meeting with you, and I think it was a meeting that was supposed to be about Ukraine, but he ended up leaning on your expertise when it came to Quebec and the question of national unity. Did you often have conversations like that about subjects of the day?
Yeah, and those would stay private. You know, that's the magic of being in politics at that level. You get to have conversations where the other person is asking you for something that you know is sincere, and it can be helpful. So of course you're going to share that information. And having spent, my political career up until then in Quebec, I was able to give him some insights, or at least some perspectives on what I had seen in the past, in the hope that it could help. That's the idea. Then you go after each other in the House after that. I remember the very last day. It was the last day of Parliament before the 2015 elections. And we were like two old boxers just slugging away, throwing each other's best stuff at each other. And when we both sat down, out of camera shot, the two of us just looked at each other and smiled as if to say, okay, that was good.
Well, I'll leave it on that note. That was good, as always, Tom. Thanks so much. Appreciate it.
All the best, Vashti. Take care.
Thank you. That's CTV News political analyst and former leader of the federal NDP, Tom Mulcair. Our front bench will be here a little bit later on the program to talk about Stephen Harper's legacy and what we heard during that unveiling ceremony from both former Prime Minister Harper and current Prime Minister Mark Carney. There are also a lot of by-elections coming up. It sounds like that we're going to unpack with Dan Moulton, Shakir Chambers, George Soul, Laura Stone, and Bob Fife. They're all with me soon. Just before that, though, Nick Nanos has some brand new numbers as that by-election bonanza looms on the horizon. Nick will be with me in just 2 minutes after a short break. Welcome back to Power Play. Not even 24 hours after the Prime Minister's office had announced Bill Blair was their new High Commissioner in the UK and vacating his seat, that the Liberals have now announced their next candidate. They've poached the deputy leader of Ontario's NDP to run in the riding of Scarborough Southwest. Dolly Begum has represented the provincial riding for the NDP since 2018 and officially resigned this morning. And just announced also this afternoon, Nate Erskine-Smith will be seeking the Ontario Liberal Party's nomination to run in the Scarborough Southwest by-election provincially, though he says he'll remain in the federal Liberal caucus for now. Begum is the second by-election candidate announced by the federal Liberals so far this week. Family physician Dr. Danielle Martin will be their candidate for the riding formerly held by Chrystia Freeland. As they prepare for upcoming by-elections, politicians are pledging to work together to make your life better. Prime Minister Mark Carney and Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre are expected to meet face-to-face this week to talk about cooperation between their parties on shared priorities. The exact timing of the sit-down hasn't been set, but Carney did confirm this morning it will take place. That meeting comes after MPs unanimously approved a Conservative motion yesterday to speed up deliberations over a GST relief bill or rebate bill that will see it clear the House of Commons by tomorrow. But if you were expecting those new vibes to trickle down into question period, maybe think again.
We have the highest food inflation in the G7. I've given my theory on why, under his leadership, Canadians are paying more faster than anyone else. What is his theory for his terrible record on food inflation?
I know the leader of the opposition is just visiting his riding. He should spend some time, I would suggest, Mr. Speaker, with the farmers in his riding.
I realize the Prime Minister is just visiting Canada.
I am always supporting Canadian farmers, as this government does.
If it's not all of his taxes on food production that's giving us the worst record, then what is?
What this government is giving Canadians is certainty with the groceries and essential benefit.
So where does all this leave the electoral landscape in Canada? Nick Nanos is the chief data scientist and founder of Nanos Research. Hi, Nick. Good to see you as always. Thanks for making the time. So you've got some brand new numbers out. Can you kind of give us a lay of the land of where things stand?
Well, it's interesting, Vashti, two things. First, the ballot numbers and then the preferred prime minister numbers. Not a lot of change in the ballot numbers. Still a 4-point advantage for the Liberals. That's what they've had for the last number of weeks in tracking. However, The really big news has to do with who Canadians would prefer as prime minister. What we've seen is a surge in favor of Mark Carney over the last while. He now has a whopping 29-point advantage over Pierre Poilievre when it comes to who Canadians would prefer as prime minister.
So give us some historical context, if you could, for those numbers in particular, Nick. Like, when's the last time you saw the positive favorabilities for a prime minister at that level?
Actually, Vashi, the last time we saw a gap like this, January 2025, it was a year ago almost, except Justin Trudeau was the prime minister, and he was 27 points behind Pierre Poilievre. So talk about a reversal of fortune. Think of it this way. A year ago, Pierre Poilievre had a massive advantage when Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, the Liberal leader, was on the ropes. Now it's almost like political trading places. Pierre Poilievre finds himself trailing Mark Carney, the Liberal leader, by 29 points.
And is it safe to say that the additional jump for Mark Carney, for the Prime Minister, is likely due to the speech in Davos and the reaction to it and kind of like the news cycle around that, do you think?
Yeah, that was basically the big news. And I think it was the combination of not just Mark Carney's speech, but Donald Trump's response to the speech. Because, you know, in the other thing that's noticeable in the tracking over the last week is that worry and concern about Donald Trump and U.S. trade has also spiked in the last week or so. So think of those two things going up. Mark Carney's brand and advantage over Pierre Poilievre on the preferred prime minister tracking, and also Canadians increasingly worried about the impact that Donald Trump might have on the Canadian economy.
How volatile has that number been? The portion of Canadians who would characterize Donald Trump and his actions very, very high on the list of issues that they're worried about? Because I feel like we've talked a lot over the last years. It's been up, it's been down. How volatile, in your view, is that?
Well, it's been in the top two for a year. So you have to think of it that way. Since the last federal election, worry about Donald Trump has either been the top issue or the second issue without exception. So what happens is that when Donald Trump puts new tariffs on Canadian goods, when he says something about Canada being the 51st state, you know, anxiety, concern, worry about Donald Trump in the United States skyrockets. So what we've seen in the last week in Donald Trump's comments related to Prime Minister Mark Carney and what he said at Davos and Donald Trump's displeasure has basically pushed up, why don't we say, the Trump anxiety meter among Canadians. But we have a statistical tie right now, Vashi, between worry about Trump and worry about jobs, but worry about Trump up in the last week.
What are the implications for that? We've talked about the government, the prime minister, but for the leader of the opposition, Pierre Poilievre, and the Conservatives, who, as you point out, from a party perspective, remain not too far away from the Liberals. He just came off a leadership review where he got a huge portion of the vote, over 87%. Like, what are the implications of what you just laid out for him and his party?
Well, the good news for the Conservatives is that they're still only 4 points back of the Liberals, right? Even with a very popular Liberal prime minister
these days.
You know, the bad news is that, you know, Pierre Poilievre significantly trails. We're going to have to wait to see for another week or so to see whether there's any positive kind of impact of the Conservative convention in Calgary and whether that event helps Pierre Poilievre close the gap. It's too early to tell right on that front, but, you know, for the Conservatives, they got to worry about trailing by 29, having their leader trail by 29 points.
I interviewed the campaign manager last night who has, it seemed clear to me, internalized the kind of data that you're presenting and talked about on a number of different fronts, sort of, you know, projecting a different tone. And in particular, we've seen evidence of that in some aspects of the House of Commons, right? Ushering through a bill faster, asking the Prime Minister to meet. That seems like a very, you know, deliberate decision to change strategy on some fronts. Does it make sense to you?
Well, I think it makes sense. I don't think there's a downside for Pierre Poilievre to kind of moderate himself in terms of his tone, not his core message, but in terms of his tone. However, what's clear from the polling data is that if Pierre Poilievre wants to be competitive with Mark Carney, he has to have a vision for how he would manage the bilateral relationship with the United States. He has to have a vision on how we would negotiate a free trade agreement. And he has to have a vision on where jobs are going to come from. And, you know, the thing is, to say that it's similar is just, it doesn't help the Conservatives close the gap. And that's the vulnerability right now. U.S.-Canada relations. The Conservatives need to assert an alternative vision, a different viewpoint, a different way that they want to manage the binational relationship, or else their leader is just going to be stuck, mired, because Canadians, when they're looking at the prime minister, who they're thinking about prime minister, they're thinking about who do they want to deal with Donald Trump. And right now it seems that Mark Carney has the advantage.
Scientist and founder of Nanos Research. I also asked him about several potential by-elections coming up. The Liberals today poached the deputy leader of Ontario's NDP to run in the riding last held by Bill Blair, with Nate Erskine-Smith just announcing he's going to run for that vacant provincial seat, but still sit in the federal caucus. And the Carney government has recruited family physician, or the Liberals rather, have family physician Dr. Danielle Martin to run in the riding last held by Chrystia Freeland. Here's what Nick Nanos had to say about whether or not these seats are safe for the Liberals.
Well, actually, in this particular environment where people are worried about jobs and the economy, I don't think there's any seat that's 100% safe. And, the thing is that even if you're a Liberal voter in some of these by-elections, you know that if the Liberals don't win the by-election, that Mark Carney will still be prime minister. I think the Liberals have to worry about the Conservatives being well organized, going into these ridings and say, send a message to Mark Carney. Send a message to Mark Carney that you want him to move faster. Send a message that you want to see results. Because Mark Carney will still be prime minister likely after these by-elections, but that the Conservatives try to make it a referendum, not on Carney, but on the fact that he's not been able to move as fast as a lot of Canadians would want him to move.
Our front bench will be here in just moments to talk about exactly that. Plus, they're going to weigh in on Prime Minister Stephen Harper's legacy as his official portrait was unveiled just moments ago here in Ottawa. Dan Moulton, Shakir Chambers, George Soule, Laura Stone, and Bob Fife. There they all are. They're back with me in just 2 minutes. Stay right there.
When Canadians see politicians betray the values and policies that they claim to believe in, I think it damages our democracy and it breeds cynicism in our politics. I'll leave it to Ms. Begum to explain to the people of Scarborough Southwest why she's abandoning the progressive policies she claimed to believe in to run for a party that is clearly governing like a Conservative party.
That's the interim leader of the federal NDP, Don Davies, weighing in on some political news today. The federal Liberals have poached the deputy leader of the Ontario NDP to run for them in a by-election whenever it happens in Bill Blair's old riding. There's lots of potential by-elections on the horizon. Plus, of course, the unveiling of former Prime Minister Stephen Harper's portrait here in Ottawa. So we've got a special edition of our front bench to talk about both those subjects. With us tonight, former senior advisor to Liberal Ontario governments of Dalton McGuinty and Kathleen Wynne. Dan Moulton is here. He's now a partner with Crestview Strategy. Next to him, Shakir Chambers worked in Prime Minister Stephen Harper's office before becoming a policy advisor to the International Trade Minister. George Soule, here in studio with me, was the former Director of Communications for the federal NDP. And Laura Stone is a Queen's Park reporter for the Globe and Mail. Plus, we've got Bob Fife here, of course, the Ottawa, the bureau chief for the Parliamentary Bureau of the Globe and Mail. Hi, everybody.
Hi.
Very nice to see you. George, I'll start with you on this subject before we get to former Prime Minister Harper. Is it a betrayal? Like, how are the Liberals snagging in both Danielle Martin and this candidate, like a more progressively minded candidate, when the federal NDP leader is framing them as not a progressive party anymore?
Well, I think that's a good question, and that's something they're going to have to answer to the voters for. I think, whenever someone in the family leaves the party, I think it's hard and it hurts us individually. I often think of the staff. It happened to me after Jack died. We lost someone who I had helped actually get elected back at home when he crossed over and decided to run for the provincial Liberals as well, actually. And, to be honest, I still haven't really forgiven him. So these things can hurt personally. I think it's up to the politician to then be able to answer for that in the election, try to square the circle of coming from a progressive, strong official opposition with Marit Stiles in Ontario to now running for a Conservative party wearing a Liberal jersey. Federally, I think that's an answer for her to have to answer for sure.
Dan, what do you think the strategy is here on the Liberals' part?
Let me start by saying I think it's an enormous achievement on the part of the Prime Minister and his political team, led by Braden Cayley and many others on that team that have been, I think, executing on a strategy which is to demonstrate to Canadians they're bringing in all sides of the political spectrum to a mission in a time of great challenge for our country. And we've seen Conservatives crossing the floor through the fall. I don't think as many people were expecting to see a New Democrat step forward for this role, move from a provincial office to join the federal party at this point in the cycle. But I think it's a demonstration that this party has a lot more political chops than people are giving it credit for, right? I think over the course of the last 12 months, there's been questions raised about the Prime Minister's political chops and whether or not he is a politician in the most traditional sense. I think he'll be the first to say sometimes he isn't. I think moves like this, moves like having Conservatives crossing the floor and the way that they've executed the timing on some of these things are a clear demonstration. This is a political force to be reckoned with.
I think it's a very fair point, Laura, and like the point especially about how before Christmas it was Conservatives moving over. Now it's a provincial NDP. You obviously cover Queen's Park. What is the take there? How damaging is this to the provincial NDP?
It was a big surprise, I think, for those who cover Queen's Park. I don't think anyone saw this coming, this particular MPP, especially because she is the deputy leader, known as quite progressive, and the Ontario NDP is a quite progressive party, and so to move over to the federal Liberals, I think to Dan's point, it does kind of speak to the breadth of the appeal. And I haven't talked to Dolly Begum personally about her decision to do that. I mean, obviously she's moving from a party in opposition to government. If she is indeed elected, she would be in government. She might have more interest on national or federal issues. She might be more interested in that, but it kind of landed like a rock, quite frankly, and it did seem like Marit Stiles was taken aback by the news. She did thank her, but she openly said in her statement that she learned of this just this morning. And so I think it does spell trouble for the provincial NDP, and it does make the provincial race in Scarborough Southwest a really interesting one to watch, because it now kind of seems like it's a three-way race potentially between the Liberals, NDP, and Conservatives. And then, of course, you have the added mix of Nate Erskine-Smith now hoping to run for the Liberals there. So it's going to be quite a big one to watch in Ontario politics.
Bob, Dan referenced kind of the moment we're in and how it's at times making strange bedfellows. And maybe that's none more evidence than the past 2 days here in Ottawa, where former Prime Minister Stephen Harper, his portrait was unveiled tonight. Lots of people from different political parties, including the current Prime Minister, on stage with him and in the room. Yesterday, a fireside chat alongside former Prime Minister Jean Chrétien. I know, if I recall the last few years of the Harper government, you were #1 reporter in their favor. I'm kidding, because you were like a dog with a bone with so many things. What did you think of the remarks today by both prime ministers and what it says about this moment?
Okay, well, there are two things. When people leave office, there is a great deal of respect, as there should be, for former prime ministers. And I thought the moment with former Prime Minister Chrétien and Harper yesterday was just one of those classic Canadian moments where they were able to talk about the importance of the country, the unity and the threats from Donald Trump. And we saw that very powerful statement from Mr. Harper in his statement today, and as he wrapped up the unveiling of his portrait, about how important it is for all parties in this times of Donald Trump breathing down our necks to work together on issues of national unity. But I cannot resist commenting on what I've heard here before with these other people. This is liberal cynicism at its worst. Look, this Miss Begum has no principles whatsoever. She was a New Democrat, a deputy leader. She sold her soul to the Liberals. And the Liberals, they don't even believe in democracy anymore. What about grassroots democracy? What about nomination meetings where you go and you fight for a nomination? No, these two, the one in Christopher and in this one, have been picked by the party to run as nomination. So there's no grassroots. There's no feeling within the party that you can go and vote for somebody. Because you know what? Liberals might not vote for Ms. Begum because they see her as what she is. She was a former New Democratic NDP leader, deputy leader. So
does it matter? Like, political parties will push back and say, like, obviously we're trying to win.
Well, of course they want to win.
All sorts of parties appoint candidates.
But I don't. At the same time, you have to call it for what it is.
Of course, that's why we have Bob Fife in the world. Yeah.
I get the sense here, the way things are being played out in this landscape, that we may be going into an election campaign.
Yeah, it doesn't feel impossible at this moment.
Yeah.
George, you want to jump in, then I'll get Shakir.
Well, yeah, just really quickly to say, that's the other part of this, right? I mean, I would be shocked if we don't see Ms. Begum in some kind of senior role if she does get elected. So I think there's more dealings going on here than just, hey, do you want to be an MP? I think there's more being offered to her, which again adds to that cynicism that Bob's talking about. And I think on top of that, having on the same day, Nate Erskine Smith announced that he's going to run in that seat. Like, this was a heavily coordinated,
it's organized, yeah.
There's a heavily coordinated plan to kind of try to get around any kind of as Bob says, grassroots elections.
Seat.
Well, and he's going to sit as an MP during the election.
I want to give the floor to Shakir. Shakir, your thoughts on that, and then maybe also because you worked in the Harper government, your reflections on what's occurring here.
I think just for Harper, I mean, to Bob's point, when you're in government, folks don't really like you. When you're out of government, people kind of praise you. So good for Harper. Obviously, a guy who's had conviction, was principled, really focused on detail and, not just making an announcement, but execution and implementing what he announced and making it, kind of the end goal of the policy there. So great for Harper. I think the one thing I would say about him, Chrétien, talking about national unity, I think it's good to see elder statesmen like that talking about, bringing the country together, parties working together. But, from what I've seen, if you look at Quebec and the PQ, I don't think they're hearing that message. And from what I saw with your interview on Sunday, Vashi, with, Jeffrey Rath, there's no way he's saying, that Harper guy has some good points and we should stop all this separatist movement. So good to hear them say that, but I think the effectiveness of this national unity piece, I get it all. But I think, it's more for the folks like Pierre on the federal level. It makes sense to cooperate on the Canada-U.S. stuff. I don't think the party does well on the Canada-U.S. Trump pieces, but also you got to hold the government to the account. You are the official opposition. You can't do what the NDP did last session and just kind of go along to get along. You see what the punishment is if you do that in the election.
Dan, I've got 30 seconds to respond to the end of democracy, if you'd like to take it.
Well, maybe I'll pick up on something that Bob laid out there at the end, which was whether or not we're about to have an election. I am skeptical that the Prime Minister is likely to call an election anytime soon. I think he would much rather govern. But I'll say, perhaps as a cynical liberal, as Bob puts it, I think the Prime Minister should call an election. I think if you look at the polling, it's very clear that he would secure a majority mandate and he should go to the polls and seek a mandate to deal with our trading relationship as we head into the CUSMA renegotiation.
Bob, you think there's going to be an election?
Well, yes, I do think we're going to into an election campaign for the reasons he's outlined. The Liberals are very good at winning because they take the when they see the opportunity, they seize it.
Okay, I'm going to leave on that note. Seize my opportunity for a commercial break. Thanks, everyone. Our front bench, Bob Fife, George Soule, Dan Moulton, Shakir Chambers, and Laura Stone. We'll take a quick break. We've got more Power Play on the other end of that break.
I sincerely hope that mine is just one of many portraits of prime ministers from both parties that will continue to be hung here for decades and centuries to come. But that will require that in these perilous times, both parties, whatever their other differences, come together against external forces that threaten our independence and against domestic policies that threaten our unity. We must preserve Canada, this country handed down to us by Providence, preserved by our ancestors and held in trust for our descendants. We must make any sacrifice necessary to preserve the independence and the unity of this blessed land.
The concluding note there from former Prime Minister Stephen Harper at the unveiling of his portrait. He delivered about a 25-30-minute speech. We heard from Prime Minister Mark Carney before him. A whole bunch of prominent Conservatives, past, present, future, were in that room. 3 of them are now in this room to talk about the speech and the legacy Mr. Harper leaves behind. This week, of course, is 20 years, marks 20 years since Stephen Harper became Prime Minister. Former Cabinet Ministers Peter MacKay, James Moore, and Tony Clement are all in studio with us right now. Hi, great to have you here. Thanks for rushing over from the ceremony. Peter, I'll start with you, and I kind of got to start where Prime Minister Harper ended. That ending of the speech was particularly poignant, given what our country faces at this moment. What did you make of it?
Yeah, I agree, Vash. I thought it was very stirring and very Stephen Harper. Understated, but there was an element of drama in what he said that resonated, certainly not just around the room, but around the country, given some of the external threats that are happening. And it was also a speech that really covered the waterfront in many ways. It's not lost on anyone that he's an economist. The current Prime Minister is an economist, and he made some good-natured jabs with respect to a balanced budget. But overall, I think it captured the moment and was very memorable to be there. It was very great to see colleagues like James and Tony. We shared a lot of those times, a lot of those experiences, and I think Stephen Harper, will go down as one of the great prime ministers, certainly of our lifetime.
For people who are watching who aren't here in Ottawa, this week is kind of like James Harperpalooza week, right? Like there's a series of events, and it must feel, I imagine, a bit like a high school reunion or a family reunion. Yeah. If you reflect on the time the Prime Minister spent in office, what are you thinking about as you think back to what we're commemorating?
I think about a lot of things. I actually think about how improbable the rise to power that Stephen Harper accomplished was likely ever to happen. He ran for the Canadian Alliance leadership with two very young kids, having left his presidency of the National Citizens Coalition, and the Conservative movement was shattered. Right? The Canadian Alliance was the official opposition, but we were mired in a civil war over Stockwell Day's leadership. We were single digits in the polls nationally. The Progressive Conservatives existed under Joe Clark's leadership, and he was intransigent and didn't want to unite. We had 13, not one or two, 13 members of Parliament who were sitting as independents, as former Canadian Alliance members of Parliament. And then you had the broad cross-section of Canadians who wanted an alternative, who just said, this is a mess and this is ridiculous. And then along comes Stephen Harper, wins the Alliance leadership, unites the caucus, brings the independents back, works with Peter MacKay, creates the new Conservative Party after he replaces Joe Clark. We go to Canadians, he holds the Paul Martin juggernaut to a minority, and then he wins an election in 2006. And his ability to do all of that inside of less than 3 years is one of the most remarkable political success stories of our lifetimes. And that's what we're honoring today, is Stephen Harper the man, and Stephen Harper the accomplishment of earning the opportunity to be the Prime Minister of the country. And it's an incredible success story.
What do you think the key to the success of those 3 years, as James lays them out, was? Like, what do you think it was about Stephen Harper that allowed for that success?
In between losing and winning the election.
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of that, we saw Stephen Harper learn from the 2004 election, make some adjustments to both himself and the team, and present a winning combination, winning formula that captured enough hearts and minds of people who had reservations about Stephen Harper. Let's not forget, I remember going door to door. I don't know about that Stephen Harper. He's a pretty scary guy. Sound familiar?
Yes.
So he was able to overcome that, and then, of course, once in power, was able to assure Canadians that he was a strong leader who also was very well versed in the economy and the politics of our nation and the unity required to keep our nation together. And he demonstrated that in his almost 10 years in office.
What do you think people don't know, who would just consume, what we've consumed over the last 20 years about Stephen Harper that you knew, Peter, from working with him around the cabinet table?
Well, he was, firstly, and I think people do appreciate this now more than perhaps when he was the Prime Minister, is that he's a raging pragmatist. He kept very, very focused on the fundamentals, very competent, obviously around the economy, passionate about our military, about the Arctic. There were aspects of his pursuits where he was clearly very emotional and invested in getting results. And I think he never lost that. He never lost that focus, even under the pressures of the job, the pushing and pulling that happens naturally in politics and even around the cabinet table. And he was also wickedly prepared. He would come to cabinet, and you would have to be fully aware that he knew your file inside and out, and you had to be ready, to present. And I will say this, and I don't know if my colleagues will agree, but he would change his mind in spite of the fact that he had this sort of rigid, outward-facing personality. But if you came and made a reasoned, thoughtful presentation to him, he would agree.
It's funny because I asked Tony that earlier on the radio show. Did he do that? Was he consultative in that way? So that's interesting to hear it from both of you. The moment of this ceremony tonight was also, like, just as a Canadian watching from the outside, kind of nice to see, given everything that we are consuming south of the border. In particular, the kind words that both prime ministers had for each other. What did you make of that? How did it feel in the room, James?
I mean, I hope I hope a lot of Canadians do take the opportunity to find the whole ceremony online and watch it. It's a good moment. Right, is that you saw the speakers of the House and Senate, the leader of the Liberal Party, the Prime Minister of the country, and the former Prime Minister, all statesmen, thoughtful, decent, credible, substantive people. And Stephen Harper, when he was Prime Minister, he made a couple of moves as well, not only policy pragmatism, but on the personnel side, right? The biggest foreign policy commitment of our lifetimes was the Afghanistan war. He reached out to John Manley and he said, work with us in the Afghanistan mission. He did a report. He wanted to have somebody who was a deal maker and who was substantive and thoughtful and had good interpersonal skills and who was a tactical politician. So he went to New Democrat Premier Gary Doer and said, can you go to Washington for me? And in British Columbia, my home province, he thought that I wasn't ready for cabinet, and he was probably right. and he reached out to David Emerson and he said, you're a substantive and thoughtful guy with deep business experience and government experience. And even though it's going to cause me some political headaches, I'd like you to be part of my cabinet. That's a prime minister who took some political risks and reached beyond the normal group of colleagues and said, if you can contribute to making the country better by making my government better, I want you to be part of my team. And there's risks associated with all of that. The extension of that is what you saw today, which is a prime minister, two prime ministers who have deep respect for each other, who have differences, but they respect those differences, and they want the country to do well. And it's a good Canadian moment of people who sincerely want the country to do well and are diplomatic and thoughtful about it. And the event that we saw today wouldn't happen in the United States for the past 10 years, probably won't happen in the United States for the next 10 years. And that's tragic. I hope I'm wrong, but it's happening in Canada, and I think we're lucky for that.
20 years out, last word to you, Tony. What do you think the legacy of Stephen Harper is at this moment?
Can I just mention one thing before I answer that question, which is it quite hurt not to have the late Jim Prentice and the late Jim Flaherty at that event. I remember them. We worked so closely together with those two great leaders and politicians. 20 years out, I believe that what I'm hearing from Canadians already is those were pretty good years. Looking back, people have a bit of tinge of nostalgia. That's automatic and understandable, but they're saying those were good years for Canada. We had, there were a few wrinkles in the Harper years, but those were pretty good years, and that's a good legacy for Stephen Harper.
Well, I'll leave it on that note. I really appreciate all of you making the time for the discussion and coming here in person. Thank you, Tony Clement, James Moore, and Peter MacKay. We'll take a quick break. We've got more Power Play in just 2 minutes. Welcome back to Power Play. You heard just a few moments ago from 3 former Harper-era cabinet ministers. They are all here in Ottawa, as are many others, and other Conservative politicians like Ontario Premier Doug Ford and Saskatchewan's Premier Scott Moe for the portrait unveiling that took place this afternoon for former Prime Minister Stephen Harper, but also for a gala that will take place tomorrow night commemorating 20 years since Stephen Harper became Prime Minister. So those festivities will be going on all week here in Ottawa. We will have continued coverage of them. There's a lot more happening on Parliament Hill, though, around the current government's agenda. In particular, tomorrow, the GST relief that the government introduced just last week, thanks to a Conservative motion to expedite the process, is expected to pass. So that's a GST rebate boost, quite significant, around 50% this year, and then 25% in each of the next 5 years. So that is expected to pass tomorrow. We will be covering any and all reaction to that as well. I'm going to leave Power Play there. I'm Vashi Capellas. Thank you so much for watching tonight. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your evening.